What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's episode of Not Your Average Meta features gameplay of Justin Fogg and his old playgroup playing in one of the most unique commander matchups we've had in recent memory. First up, we have Eddie back to defend his undefeated channel record playing Extus Oriq Overlord. This is a Mardu deck that looks to sack and recur creatures in a classic aristocrat fashion. Next, we have Chris trying to get his first channel win, and he's playing Aeve, Progenitor Ooze. This is a mono-green Ooze tribal deck that looks to out-ooze everybody at the table. Then we have Justin playing one of his non-Demir decks, and that's Rashmi, Eternities Crafter. This deck looks to cast spells on every player's turn in order to get ultimate value from his commander. Lastly, we have Fogg playing his upgraded Leinore Autumn Sovereign Precon deck. This is a human tribal deck that looks to use the power of 1/1 counters and the Covenant ability to overrun his opponents. Now that we have our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Eddie plays a tapped Bloodfell Caves, gaining a life. Chris plays a tapped Myriad Landscape. Justin draws and plays a Forest and taps one for turn 1 Soul Ring. Fogg draws and plays a tapped Path of Ancestry and passes. Eddie draws and plays a Mountain. He then taps 2 for a tapped Guardian Idol. Chris draws and plays a Forest. Justin draws, plays an island, then taps out to cast his commander Rashmi. Fogg draws and plays a tapped Temple Garden, scrying 1. Eddie then taps for turn and plays a Plains. He then taps out to cast his Sifter of Skulls. Chris plays another Forest and taps 3 to cast an Inexorable Blob. Justin draws and plays a Forest. He then casts You Happen Upon a Glade, triggering Rashmi. He then reveals a Mirror Maid, putting it to hand. He then casts Talisman of Curiosity before going to find a land. Fogg draws and plays a Forest before tapping 3 to cast Champion of Lamwall. Eddie draws and plays a Plains. He then taps 4 for a Falconwrath Aristocrat. He then goes to combat swinging both his creatures at Chris for 8 damage. Chris untaps and taps 2 for a Scavenging Ooze. He then taps 2 for an Explore, now playing another land and drawing a card. Justin draws and plays another island. He then delves away some cards to cast Treasure Cruise. He then reveals a negate off the top of his library, putting it to hand, then draws 3 and passes. Fogg draws and plays a Karn's Bastion. Fogg then taps out to cast Keeper of the Accord, putting a counter on his champion. Eddie untaps and casts Pitiless Plunderer. He then goes to attack, swinging his Aristocrat at Justin for 4. On his instep, Fogg gets a Soldier token. Chris untaps a turn and plays a Forest. He then taps 2 to crack his Myriad Landscape to go get 2 more forests and passes. Justin draws for turn and plays an island. He then taps 4 to cast Leyline of Anticipation, revealing a forest off the top of his library. Fogg untaps and plays his own Myriad Landscape before going to get a Plains from his Keeper of the Accord. He then taps 2 to cast Catilda, scrying 1 from his path and adding a counter to his champion. He then taps 3 more to cast Nils, Discipline Enforcer, and another 3 to cast Augur of Autumn, adding 2 more counters to his champion. He then goes to his instep and adds a counter to Eddie's Aristocrat, Justin's Rashmi, and Chris's Oozeboy. Eddie draws and goes to combat, swinging his Aristocrat at Justin, who responds by targeting his Aristocrat with a Raven form, revealing an Aether Snipe with Rashmi. Eddie responds by sacking his Sifter to his Aristocrat and creating a treasure token with his Plunderer. Then his Aristocrat gets exiled and gets a 1/1 blue bird token. He then casts a Chroma's Vengeance to wipe the board, and in response, Chris casts Withstand Death to save his Scavenging Ooze. Chris starts his turn by drawing and playing a Forest. He then casts Doubling Season and passes. Justin draws for turn, plays another Forest, and recasts his commander, Rashmi. Fogg draws and taps 4 for a Guardian Project. He then taps 2 to cast Mikasa Lunar for 1, he then scries 1 off his path before drawing, and playing a Sunpetal Grove as his land for turn. Eddie draws and casts Sedgemoor Witch. At the end of turn, Chris exiles a creature from both Eddie and Fogg's graveyards with the Scavenging Ooze gaining 2 life. Chris then starts his turn and draws. He then casts Ochre Jelly for 4, which becomes 8 because of Doubling Season. He then swings a Scavenging Ooze at Fogg for 7 and passes. Justin draws for turn, then delves away some more cards to cast Ethereal Forager for 4. He then reveals Rampant Growth off the top of his library, casting it for free. He then goes and gets a forest and passes. Fog draws for turn, then casts his commander Leinore. He then scribes one off the path, bottoming it before drawing. He then casts Ranger Class, getting a 2/2 Wolf token. He then goes to combat, putting a counter on his wolf from his commander, then draws off the Coven trigger. Eddie untaps for turn and plays a tap to Malakar Mire. He then taps out for Sir Conrad the Grim. At the end of his turn, Chris exiles 2 more cards with his Ooze from Eddie and Fogg's graveyards. With the Sifter leaving the graveyard, Sir Conrad deals 1 damage to each opponent. Chris then plays a force for turn to cast Circle of Dreams Druid before casting his commander Aeve. He gets 1 token copy and almost dumps all of his dice everywhere.
Oh shit. Get that on camera.
He then goes to combat and swings his Jelly at Justin for 8 and his Ooze at Eddie for 11. At the end of his turn, Justin casts Growth Spiral, revealing Insidious Will, putting it to hand. He then draws and plays another land. Justin then starts his turn casting Tireless Provisioner. He then reveals Said Done, putting it to hand. He then plays an island for turn and creates a treasure before passing. Fog draws for turn and plays an Evolving Wilds. Kraken to go get a forest. He then goes to combat, putting another counter on Mikaeus, then draws off his Coven trigger. He then casts Dust, destroying all creatures power 3 or greater. Kristen gets 2 8/8 Ooze tokens, and Fog pays 3 to uptick his Ranger class. Eddie draws and then taps 2 for an Orzhov Signet, then taps another 4 to cast his commander Extus. Chris draws and taps 5 to cast Nyx Bloom Ancient, which then gets countered by Justin with Rewind. Justin then reveals an island off the Rashmi trigger and puts it to hand. Chris then swings 1 Ooze at Justin and 1 Ooze at Fog. Fog blocks with Mikaeus, then taps him to put a counter on his creatures, while Justin just takes the 8. Justin starts his turn by drawing. He then pays 3 in order to evoke Aether Snipe. He uses the Aether Snipe trigger to bounce one of Chris's tokens back to his hand. He then reveals the command sphere off the Rashmi trigger, casting it. He then plays an island and passes. Fog draws for turn and plays a Canopy Vista. He then casts Dawn from his graveyard, returning all his creatures from his graveyard to his hand. Fog then recasts Catilda, drawing a card. He then recasts Nil's Discipline Enforcer, scrying 1 to the bottom of his library from his Path of Ancestry, before drawing from his Guardian Project trigger. He then goes to combat, putting a counter on his commander, and then down his instep, putting a counter on each of his opponent's creatures. Eddie starts his turn by drawing, then he taps 5 mana in order to cast a Requiem Angel, before passing his turn to Chris. Chris draws, then taps 4 for Renata, then moves to combat. Before he declares his attacks, Justin casts the Done half of Said Done, tapping his Ooze and his Druid. He then reveals Stunt Double off his Rashmi trigger, putting it to hand. Justin draws for turn, then taps 8 to cast Amanatu's Augury. He reveals Temple of Mystery off his library and plays it for turn. He then exiles the top 8 cards of his library. After which he plays an island, set adrift to bounce Chris's Ooze token, and Reality Shift on Fog's Nils. He then exiles the rest and passes. Fog starts his turn by drawing and then playing a command tower as his land for turn. He then casts Champion of Lambholt, drawing a card from the Guardian Project trigger. He then casts a Realm Walker, naming humans, drawing a card, and then also putting a counter on his Champion of Lambholt. He then recast Mikaeus the Lunark for 1, putting a counter on his champion, and then scrying one to the bottom of his library before drawing an additional card off his Guardian Project trigger. After drawing, Fog taps 4 to cast a new card from the commander set, Celebrate the Harvest, to go into his library and find 3 lands to put into play tapped. He then moves to his combat step and he puts an additional counter on his Champion of Lamholt and draws another card off his Coven trigger from his commander. He then passes the turn to Eddie. Eddie draws for turn and doesn't get another land. He then taps 2 for a Boros Signet. He then casts Grey Merchant of Asphodel, draining all his opponents for 4 life, while he gains 12. Eddie then moves to combat and he swings his Requiem Angel at Chris in the air for 5, and swings his commander on the ground at Fog. Fog blocks with Mikaeus, while Chris just doesn't block and takes a 5 damage. Chris starts his turn by untapping all of his permanents. He then draws and he plays a Gaia's Cradle before counting up all of his lands. He then taps enough to recast Aeve again, who gets countered by Justin with Insidious Will. Justin then reveals Eureka Moment off the top of his library and puts it to hand. Chris then swings Renata at Justin, who blocks with Rashmi. Justin starts his turn by playing an island. He then recasts Rashmi. Then casts Body Double as a copy of Nyx Bloom Ancient. He then reveals a forest with a Rashmi trigger and puts it to hand. Fog untaps a turn, then taps 3 for Frontline Medic. He then puts a counter on his champion, scrying off his path before drawing. He then casts Verge Ranger, putting a counter on champion and drawing a card. He then casts Esper Sentinel off the top of his library, putting another counter on his champion and drawing. He then casts Regina's Sanction, choosing himself as a friend and putting a counter on all of his creatures, and everybody else's foes, tapping on all but one of their creatures. He then morphs his Armorcraft Judge over and goes to combat, putting a counter on Esper Sentinel and drawing from the Coven trigger. He then swings 18 damage at Eddie, putting a counter on his commander from Ranger class on attack. Eddie untaps return and casts Costly Plunder, sacking his merchant, who with the trigger on the stack gets returned to his hand with the Extus made trap trigger. He then doesn't pay the 2 for Sentinel, so Fog draws 1 card where Eddie draws 2. Eddie then recasts Grey Merchant, draining everyone for 4 again and gaining 12. He then swings his Angel at Fog for 5 and his commander Justin, who decides not to block and dies. He then passes to Chris. Chris then taps return and then he draws. He then thinks for a second and he plays a Reliquary Tower. He then taps enough lands to recast his commander once again. Fog draws for turn and plays a land. He then casts a Johnny the Greathearted, giving all of his creatures vigilance, and Pledge of Unity, putting a counter on all his creatures, and he gains 8 life. He then upticks a Johnny to gain 3 more life before casting Search for Glory to go find a legendary card in his library. Fog then casts a Haru, drawing and puts more counters on his champion and Sentinel. He then goes to combat, putting a counter on his Sentinel and drawing from the Coven trigger. He then swings his commander, champion, and medic at Eddie, taking him down to 13 life, while also making all of his creatures indestructible. Second main, he taps his remaining creatures and casts Cleansing Nova to destroy all creatures, and he passes. Eddie draws and taps 4 for Nivenril's Disc, and another 2 for Young Peasy. He then swings 2 in the air at Fog, taking him down to 19. Chris draws for turn to cast Consuming Blob and gets 2 Ooze tokens at his end step. Fog untaps for turn, and with no answers to his human army, Eddie and Chris decide to concede the game to Fog. Today's big winner is Fog Raw playing his slightly modified Leinore Autumn Sovereign Precon. I admit I was the first one to call out the Coven mechanic during spoilers, and I didn't think it was going to be very effective in most games, but I was 100% wrong. Leinore is the MVP of this game because of the value she provided, adding extra counters to Esper Sentinel and Champion of Lamholt, on top of the additional card draw provided an incredible amount of extra value in this game. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.